There's a specific kind of teenager that adults love to point at. She's so responsible. He handles things better than most adults I know. That kid has her head on straight. And everyone in the room nods, like they're witnessing something rare and beautiful. Like early maturity is a sign that this particular teenager is going to be just fine. Ha, maybe more than fine. Like they skipped the messy, uncertain part of growing up and landed somewhere better. But here's what nobody asks. What did it actually cost them to get there? Because there's a version of teenage maturity that comes from genuine growth, from good experiences, good guidance, real confidence building over time. And then there's another version, the one that looks identical from the outside, but comes from something completely different. The one that was built not by thriving, but by surviving. And if you've ever been described as mature for your age as a teenager and felt somewhere underneath that compliment, like something was quietly off, this video is for you. If this kind of content makes you understand yourself and the people around you differently, subscribe to Blue Money Mind. I'm Berg, and this is exactly what we do here. So let's talk about what actually happens inside a teenager who grows up too fast. Not a child, a teenager. Because this matters. Adolescence is not just a social phase. It is one of the most neurologically critical periods in human development. The brain is actively reorganizing itself during these years. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for judgment, emotional regulation, identity formation, long-term thinking, is still being built. The stress response system is maturing. And this window, roughly between 12 and 19, is when a person is supposed to be figuring out who they are, testing identities, making mistakes, feeling things without immediately having to manage them. That process is not optional. It is not a luxury. It is how the brain learns to be an adult. And when a teenager spends that window managing everyone else's emotions instead of their own, when they become the stable one, the responsible one, the one the family depends on, that developmental process gets interrupted at exactly the wrong moment. Research on chronic stress during adolescence shows that it produces long-term changes in cognition, in how the brain processes ambiguous situations, in decision-making patterns that persist well into adulthood. The brain doesn't just feel the pressure. It reorganizes around it. It builds itself to handle a world that is always slightly on the edge of crisis. And here is the part that most people completely miss. The teenager doesn't feel like something is wrong. In fact, they often feel proud. They feel needed. They feel like they figured something out that their peers haven't figured out yet. While other teenagers are worried about parties and relationships and what to wear, this one is handling real things, serious things, and adults around them reinforce that feeling constantly. Teachers notice it. Relatives comment on it. The message they receive over and over is that their maturity is an achievement. What nobody tells them is that it might also be a loss. Because what is actually happening underneath that praised maturity is something psychologists describe with a term that sounds almost bureaucratic but carries an enormous amount of weight: parentification. It's when a teenager is placed, consciously or not, into the emotional or functional role of an adult within the family. Maybe they became the emotional anchor for a parent who couldn't regulate their own feelings. Maybe they were the one keeping track of bills, managing younger siblings, holding the household together while the adults around them weren't able to. Maybe they were the person a parent called after a breakdown, the one who learned to read every shift in the room's energy before anyone else noticed it. And what makes it so hard to see even in retrospect is that it often doesn't look like anything went wrong. The teenager seems capable. The family seems functional. Nobody is obviously falling apart. But the role reversal is there, quiet and complete. What the research shows is that this experience wires something very specific into the developing brain. The teenager learns, at a neurological level, that their value is conditional. Not in abstract terms, in lived, repeated, daily experience. Their worth becomes tied to how useful they are, to whether they show up, to whether they manage the situation well. And adolescence is exactly the period when identity formation is supposed to be happening, when the brain is building the answer to the question, who am I? But when every signal a teenager receives says you are, the one who holds things together, the identity that gets built is not really theirs. It's a role, a function, a survival adaptation that got mistaken for a personality. This creates a specific kind of invisible exhaustion that follows these teenagers into adulthood. Because the hypervigilance, the constant, low-grade scanning for tension, for problems, for what might go wrong, doesn't disappear when the situation that created it does. Psychologists describe hypervigilance as a state where the nervous system stays permanently on alert, even in environments that are objectively safe. For a teenager who spent years monitoring a parent's mood before saying a word, or predicting family crises before they erupted, that alertness becomes the baseline. It becomes the only way of being in the world they know. And one of the cruelest parts of this is that it often gets interpreted by others and by themselves as emotional intelligence. Because they are good at reading rooms. They are good at sensing tension. They are perceptive and careful and attuned. But there is a difference between emotional intelligence that you choose to apply and hypervigilance that you cannot turn off. One comes from security. The other comes from never having felt fully safe. And then something interesting happens when these teenagers become adults. Many of them become high achievers, driven, reliable, the person everyone in the office or the friend group leans on. They build successful lives, and from the outside, it looks like the maturity that was praised in them as teenagers paid off. But inside, something doesn't quite add up. The success doesn't satisfy the way they expected it to. They reach a goal, and instead of feeling fulfilled, they feel a strange emptiness, and almost immediately start scanning for the next problem to solve. Because the stillness is uncomfortable. Because they were never taught how to simply exist without something to manage. Because their nervous system was trained during the most formative years of their life to associate rest with danger and busyness with safety. Research on what's called high-functioning codependency captures this pattern with uncomfortable precision. These are people who appear emotionally steady and highly capable, but whose internal sense of security depends entirely on over-responsibility, on being needed, on never dropping the ball. Not because they genuinely enjoy it, but because somewhere in the adolescent brain that was rewired by too much pressure too soon, being useful still feels like the only reliable way to justify taking up space. Now here's where the nuance matters, because not every teenager who carried weight early ends up broken. Some of them developed genuine resilience, real empathy, an ability to navigate complexity that their peers genuinely didn't have. Those are real things. They shouldn't be dismissed. But, and this is worth sitting with, there is a difference between strength and a coping mechanism that was never given a choice. A teenager who becomes empathetic through safe, supported experience learns when to offer that empathy and when to step back. A teenager whose empathy was forged by having to manage adult emotions has empathy they cannot switch off, cannot protect themselves with, cannot separate from obligation. One is a capacity. The other is a survival pattern wearing the mask of a virtue. What the research describes at its deepest level is this. Teenagers who were forced into adult roles during the years when they should have been forming their own identity often never fully internalize the belief that they are enough simply as they are. Not for what they do. Not for how reliable they are. Not for how well they hold things together. Just for existing. And that gap, that absence at the core, is what drives the particular kind of exhaustion these people carry for decades without being able to name it. They don't know how to receive care without immediately giving something back. They don't know how to let someone else carry the weight. They don't know how to stop performing competence long enough to actually feel what's underneath it. And maybe the most disorienting part of all of this is the specific loneliness it creates. Being the person everyone depends on feels from the outside like connection. But it is often the loneliest position in any room because people see the function, the reliability, the calm, the capability, but not the person behind it. Oh, and the teenager who built their entire identity around being that function grew up without ever being fully seen. So, what does all of this actually mean? It means that when we look at a teenager and say they're so mature for their age, we should probably stop and ask, at what cost? Because maturity that comes from surviving too much, too young, is not the same as maturity that comes from growing well. One is a sign that something went right. The other is a sign that a teenager had to become something they weren't ready to be in order to hold together a situation that was never their responsibility. And learning to tell the difference in yourself or in someone you know is not a small thing. It is the beginning of a much more honest conversation about what we actually mean when we call a young person mature. You didn't grow up fast. You just never got to grow at your own pace. And that distinction matters more than most people ever stop to realize. If this video named something you've been carrying for a long time, leave a comment. I genuinely want to know if it landed. And if Blue Money Mind is the kind of channel that helps you see human behavior more clearly, subscribe. There's much more of this coming.